Why are silences so important to master in any presentation? Why are they also so difficult to master? And what are my tips and tricks to make sure that you can use silences in the right way whenever you get up on stage? These are the three questions that I'll be answering in this week's episode of MasterTalk. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining me today on this episode. Very important one, I would say, of MasterTalk. So let's start by talking about why silences are so important in any presentation. I fundamentally believe that for every person that I've coached in the last 2 years of my bachelor's degree, that silences are a major difference between great presenters and exceptional presenters. Think about your favorite TEDx talk or your favorite TED talk. Like, for example, Sir Ken Robinson, when he talks about how schools kill creativity. In his TEDx talk, which is probably one of the most viewed ones on the website, he talks a lot about the key idea that is schools kill creativity, but notice also the way that he communicates his message. He uses silences very masterfully throughout his whole presentation to make sure that the audience is reeled into the really good parts. And this example can be applied to virtually any very good presenter, and this is why I believe silences are so important for you to get a hang of and so important for you to use in your presentations for the moments that matter, but also when you really want to get your audience excited about specific parts in your presentation. Which begs the question now, why do I believe that silences are such a difficult topic to master for most of us? And the best way for us to answer this question is for me to take you on a journey on a small story. Remember those high school days? In high school, you're young, you're probably between the ages of 13 and 18, but most importantly, there was a lot of presentations that you had to give in high school. So in those classes, I want you to think about a subject that you didn't like too much. Maybe for some it's sciences, for some it might be math. For me, it was history, going into my world history class every week. So when I came in as a 14, 15-year-old, I came into my first class of the semester. And of course, the usual, the prof comes up and says, okay, everyone needs to do an oral presentation, and they have to pick a time period throughout the last 5,000 years, and you have to present a 20-minute presentation alone to an audience that's so interested about history. I'm obviously being sarcastic here. So you spend a couple of hours preparing the presentation, you're ready to go, you're so excited to give this very elaborate PowerPoint, and then you look at the audience. A bunch of 15, 14-year-olds. Maybe history is not really the most interesting thing for them. And for the teacher especially, she just happens to be sick that day, so she's not paying that much attention. So automatically in your brain, the first thing that you think about is, how do I get in and get out of this presentation as fast as possible? So you start talking about the Renaissance and how important it is according to your hours of research on Wikipedia. And then you freeze after 60 seconds because you forget what you have to say next. And that is the first exposure that people have to silences. So if you go back to the story, once somebody freezes in that presentation and they're looking at an audience that doesn't really want to be there, or a teacher that's half there because they're sick for some reason, people really see silences as something scary. So for example, if I forget what to say, then in that context, I start freaking out, I start getting nervous because I see silences as a burden to my presentation rather than the solution to my presentation. So of course, after that silence happens, I quickly start freaking out and I look at my slide and I get back on track. And that happens probably 5 or 10 times during the whole presentation. But here's the catch. History isn't the only class that you present in. There's math class, science class, in some cases even gym class, and it goes on, and you're essentially conditioned through hundreds of presentations during your high school, your early days, that silences are a bad thing and not a good thing. This brings me to the second point of my argument. Why silences are so difficult to master. Because we see silences as a burden rather than a solution to our public speaking abilities. It's very hard for us to be convinced that silences are even important to begin with and are even worth practicing. This is why I believe that silences and mastering them is the same thing as trying to cook for the first time. When you're cutting those veggies for the first time for, let's say, a stir fry or something, it's very difficult for you at the beginning to get it right because sometimes the vegetables won't be cooked or cut exactly symmetrical. The same thing applies to public speaking, right? And in silences specifically. So if you go back to the cooking analogy, as you start cooking and you start cutting more vegetables, you get better at it. And then you start understanding the benefits of having everything symmetrical so that it's easier to cook and that everything is evenly cooked. So the same thing applies to silences. Until you're convinced to yourself, until you've convinced yourself that silences are essentially very important for your success as a presenter, it'll be really hard for you to improve. So this brings me to my third point, which is how do we master silences? What are some of my tips and tricks? And I like to call my tip, essentially, it's called the forced silence drill. So this is how it goes. So pick any pitch that you like, a 2-minute, 3-minute pitch that you enjoy. And in that 2-3-minute pitch it as you usually do. So let's say, for example, you had a presentation about spaghetti. So you spend 3 minutes talking about spaghetti in this 3-minute pitch. So I want you to record that full 3 minutes of spaghetti, of you talking about your spaghetti. And then watch the recording. Then, in a second version of the presentation, ideally you'd want to do this with a partner because it's much easier. You can still do it alone, but I think it's easier to do with a partner. So in that second version of the presentation, do the same exact pitch, but do one of two things. One, for the ones who are a bit more ambitious, have your partner point at you like this whenever he wants you to silence or she wants you to silence. So for example, if you're talking about something like spaghetti, you're saying, oh, spaghetti is so great, I love the feel, I love the taste of this spaghetti, then your partner will do this. So at this point, it doesn't matter where you're at in the presentation, you have to say nothing. So let's say I do this with myself and I say, oh, spaghetti is great and it's nutritious. So this way, it forces me to use silences in a way that I never did before. And here's the punchline. So as your partner is doing that, at the end of the presentation, you can then watch the recording, compare both versions. What I find is when students look at both versions, they realize how more effective they are as a public speaker when they watch the second version of the presentation with a bunch of silences. Another way of doing this is telling your partner, this is an easier way, that you want them to point you at you want them to point at you at specific parts in the presentation. So let's say you want them to point at you after you say that spaghetti is great, so then you know the silence is coming, so you're able to prepare for that. And that's exactly how I weave silences into my presentations. So for example, if I'm pitching to an audience, even before I even go through the slide deck with the audience, to prep for the presentation, I look at my slide deck and I say, okay, this is what I want to say, and where is the moment in these presentations where I can silence to deliver the most important parts and keep my audience interested? So with forced silence drills, you'll be able to master silences and get yourself on track to being an amazing public speaker. If you guys like this video, be sure to hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to hit that like button if you also enjoyed it. And one thing I want to leave you with is if there's one person that you know that is still afraid to get on stage and is afraid of public speaking, send this video so they'll be one step closer to mastering their talk. See you next week.